I'd like to welcome you to this conference. I'm Dr. Hugh Stephens. I'm the convener and coordinator of today's symposium. Now those of you who probably don't know me, I'm an Ashland native. Do you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I'm retired from the Political Science Department of the University of Houston, where I specialize in terrorism and emergency management a good deal of my career, and also served as chairman of the local emergency planning committee for the city of Houston. Let me just briefly today outline the major players and elements above our symposium. The sponsors include RiverLink, Mountain County, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Wilma Dykeman Legacy, Duke Energy, the Biltmore Company, and the Western North Carolina Historical Association. I want to thank AV Tech for making this room available to us without charge. And I would be remiss in my duties if I did not ask you to remember Karen Craig Nolan, who I went to when I first had this idea and got a lot of encouragement from her. And she, of course, is in poor physical shape now and has not been able to participate, but she did have an important part in the origins of this. The organizing committee consists of 3 people. One, Jim Stokely, who's president of the Wilma Dykeman Legacy and will chair today's initial panel, which focuses on the short and long-term effects of the 1916 flood. And then the second person is William Hassell, who is the USGS Chief of the Asheville Field Office, North Carolina Water Science Center. And he will chair the second panel today on what emergency managers have learned about flooding in Western North Carolina since 1916. The chair of the third group, which will be sort of a round table discussion as I understand it, is Jerry Behon, and I think just about everybody in this room knows. He will moderate the afternoon panel, which will be a round table discussion on preparations for future flooding. So we have 1916, what happens between then and 2004, and then the third panel. I want to thank these 3 individuals who haven't seen them recognized in the program, but they really were key elements in putting this together. I've left it up to them to introduce the participants on their panels as they come up. I might add here, what's the rationale for all of this? What's prompted this considerable effort? Specifically, why should flooding in this area constitute a major public issue? Well, we are at the centennial of the worst disaster in Western North Carolina history. Moreover, we experienced a similar flood in 2004 and several floods between 1916 and 2004. The major issue today is how you prepare for another 100-year flood or something that bad. The odds are we'll have another soon. In fact, I'm Don't know why it's not raining like, oh, get out outside right now as God decides that we need to be reminded. Anyway, our intention is to evaluate our preparedness to meet such an event. This symposium ought to be regarded as part of an ongoing learning process about the major danger in our community in this whole area. It requires careful research, such as the type of work which is embodied in the National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center located at UNC Asheville that provides useful information about flooding to our civil governments and major economic entities. It is absolutely worth the effort. Those involved in any aspect of emergency management know that advanced preparation, which improves our speed and accuracy in response, saves the community from much human trauma and physical destruction. It stands to reason that investment in advance to mitigate flooding is well worth the expense and the effort. It's harder to replace infrastructure once it's gone, and people who drown in a flood are permanently lost, which is the other aspect of this. I've not come across a comprehensive evaluation of the economic losses of the 1916 flood, although some believe that the adverse effects in this area may have extended as far forward as the 1970s. In other words, in a lot of ways, we didn't get over the effects of this flood for 50 or more years. We often overlook that. And we look forward to we look forward to Anthony Sadler's paper on this, which will come very soon. It's appropriate here to note that there is a difference in the emphasis of today's panels relative to those tomorrow. I hesitate to speak or describe these at all because I'm not familiar with them in any great detail. But it seems tomorrow has a fascinating lineup about human interest and damage and things like that. Ours is more designed to create a framework or build on a framework for emergency management. That is, plans and preparations for managing coordinated response. Given the distinction between these two aspects, today's panels embody, as I say, a somewhat different emphasis. In light of flooding in this area between 1916 and 2004, with 1916 as our baseline, the panelists will focus on what we have learned over time, our ability today to meet the requirements of successful flood management. In a largest sense, I guess, it is part of an ongoing effort to improve a framework for flood response in the Asheville area, western North Carolina as well, that will serve as a viable guide to improvement over time. Thank you for that, and I'll turn it over to
name is Jim Stokely. Welcome you to the conference. A word about cell phones: turn them off. That's one word: turn them off. I'd like to introduce, for the first panel, our first speaker, Dr. Milton Reddy. We're delighted to have him here, have him kick off this conference. He is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. He attended Rice University and the University of Houston, and he earned his PhD at the University of Georgia. His regional histories, fiction, and essays are informed, as he puts it, I'm going to quote, actually the rest of this introduction is a quote from Dr. Reddy. By childhood spent in rural rough-knuckle Texas, a stint in the Army, and a love for the history of humble places. I have always found the history of wherever I happen to be, whether Willis, Texas, Athens, Georgia, Asheville, North Carolina, or Madison County in the western North Carolina mountains, to be fascinating. So, get set for a fascinating review of the Great Flood of 1916, Dr. Milton Reddy.
First, I want to thank those of you who are here for coming. It's good of you to take some time off to hear us and to really think through what will happen in the future, what has happened in the past. I also want to acknowledge, and I too would be remiss if I didn't remember Karen Craig Nolan and your mother, Wilma Dyckman Stokely, who wrote her book, 1955 book, The French Broad, or the Rivers of America series. I think one of two still in print since 1955. I heartily recommend it. And I do want to tell you that when I came in, it was sort of cloudy outside. It looked like rain. We're sitting here. This is Victoria Hill. It overlooks the French Broad River. I've always considered the French Broad to be a mystical river. It's the organ of creation. It is the genesis of western North Carolina. You heard, and Hugh referred to this, about the floods in the past and the ones we're going to have in the future. I'm going to look at 1916, at the Great Flood. I'm going to describe it, first of all, as the Katrina of the mountains. It is the most catastrophic event, natural event, that western North Carolina has ever incurred. Politically, we've had one or two others. As a natural disaster, this is it. It struck on July the 16th, 1916. And that is curiously a century ago. A century ago. And July the 15th, the day that we're meeting, was the key day in all of this. It all started with the first of two unnamed hurricanes. They didn't have names for them back then. At one point, I called one Little Abner, and the second one, Daisy May. The first came into Mobile, Alabama on July the 5th. The second, the deadlier Charleston, South Carolina on July the 14th. What are the chances? Two hurricanes a century ago coming into two different spots and both affecting just the French Broad River Basin. The first lingered over western North Carolina for a week, and it rained, and it rained. It dumped perhaps a foot of rain over the French Broad River Valley. If you live in the mountains, if you know something about the mountains, you'll understand the soil here. I grew up in Texas. We had 30 inches of rain, and the next day we mowed the yard. We really do. It just goes right through our sandy soil. Here, the rain doesn't. Rocky, subsoil 6 to 18 inches, it runs off. It runs off. Steered by that same unyielding high-pressure system. The second followed a few days later, on July the 15th. On July the 15th, the skies here in western North Carolina biblically opened. At Alta Pass, if you don't know it, your grandfather mountain, a gauging station recorded over 22 inches it fell in 24 hours. That's the greatest and highest one-day rainfall total ever recorded in the mountains, although I'm sure that somewhere more has fallen. Even without an already soggy, saturated ground, swollen rivers, streams, and valleys, the mountains could not have withstood those totals. A few days ago, I went hiking on Whiteside Mountain. Near Caches, Jackson County, very close to Macon. At the top, they had a sign, Eastern Continental Divide. Usually when I come up to Asheville from Tryon, where I live, I pass another sign that says, Eastern Continental Divide, near Hendersonville. That is one of the most crucial elements in the story of the Great Flood of 1960. That Continental Divide, and there's nothing more fascinating than to go on Google Earth, pull it up graphically, 3D, street level, any sort of way you want to look at it. Draw that line and see how it pins in the French Broad River Valley. It does. That proved to be one of the most unyielding points in promoting the Great Flood. It helped turn Asheville into a giant pond. Rosman and Fletcher too. At the height of the Great Flood, the French Broad River, just down from where you're sitting, was more than a mile across. Imagine that. Water falling to the east and to the south of the Eastern Continental Divide principally flows into the Broad, the Green, the Pacolet, the Catawba, the Linville rivers, eventually emptying into the Atlantic Ocean 200 miles away. Yet things change on the western and the northern side of the Eastern Continental Divide. In studying the mountains history, that of North Carolina, to me it's just fascinating to know the French Broad flows north from Hendersonville into Tennessee. For riverboats, for rafting, for all sorts of things. Fishing, commerce, that's crucial. For lumbering, for tanning, animal husbandry, that's a crucial element. On the western side of the divide, every single drop somehow finds its way into the French Broad River. Again, mystical, magical, and mischievous. It still is. The second hurricane now a tropical depression, parked right over western North Carolina, in the heart of the storm, and you're very, very close to that. Perhaps 12 to 22 inches fell. Go outside the boundaries. Go past Statesville. Go past Murphy. 2 inches. More, less, but not 2 feet. It stayed right over us. On July the 16th, they called it localized flooding, became the Great Flood. Rivers crested, ponds, creeks, everything. Early on the morning of July the 16th, earthen dams from Lakes Cayuga and Osceola near Hendersonville, Lake Toxaway, near Roswell, were reached, then failed altogether. I came over the Lake Toxaway Dam this morning on my way in from Highlands. They're still working on it. Just before dawn, July the 16th, a tumultuous, angry, 10-foot tidal wave came sweeping down the French Broad River from Hendersonville toward Asheville. They've never liked us in Hendersonville. At Biltmore Village, perhaps the most flood-prone in the entire city, it collided with the Shenandoah River, already out of its banks. And the Shenandoah, again, is one of the great mysteries. Most of you can't even see it. You don't even know it's there. But it's still capable of flooding. The morning of July the 16th, 1916, in Asheville, in western North Carolina, the skies were clear and sunny. Beautiful day. People had been cooped up for 2 weeks. So what do Mountaineers do? They come out. 6 a.m. in the morning. Beautiful. They start doing their chores. And at that same time, the flood hit. Caught by surprise, streetcars, automobiles, hotels, homes, and warehouses hastily were abandoned. People scrambled to find higher ground. On the banks of the Shenandoah, a 17-year-old girl, Kathleen Carter, left her home as the waters rose. She struggled to make it to a friend's second-story apartment on Village Green. You know it as Biltmore Avenue. Within 1 hour, the river rose so high that she could barely struggle. It was up to her neck. At the gate to the Biltmore estate, the river rose to 9 feet. I still think they have that marked somewhere on the entrance. But it never touched the Biltmore house. Frederick Law Homestead did a brilliant job of locating it. He really did. To escape these surging waters, Kathleen Carter desperately climbed a maple tree bordering the Village Green. There she stayed for the rest of the day. Her story and her face became that of the Great Flood. I've often thought of what a 17-year-old girl saw for 8 to 12 hours while she sat on that limb watching the river rise. She lost most of her family. Rushing waters swept people away. It did 2 men at the old Glen Rock Hotel in the waterfront district. And that's another story that Hugh Stephens alluded as to the lasting effect of the Great Flood. And certainly it affected the waterfront district. Depot Street, you call it the River Arts District today, the brewery down there. Back then, I think it was probably the economic engine of Asheville. Tanning yards, warehouses, lumber yards, everything floated down Pigeon River from this river. It all collected historically. They had pens for stock, livestock. You could buy anything. Railroad came right through there. In the old Glen Rock Hotel, one of the vendor guys was white and the other black. They're trying to help others. Just north of Belmont, North Carolina, 10 railway workers out of 21 trying to remove debris from around the bridge were swept away when the bridge collapsed. 10 drowned. In all, perhaps 80 people, we don't know for sure, died in the Great Flood of 1960. Waters would not begin to recede until 2 days later. The railroad would not come back into Asheville from Spartanburg until August the 6th. As the first broad leaves Asheville and moves north toward Marshall, Hot Springs, it canalizes and it begins to drop. It increases in speed and in flow. So therefore, Marshall, Hot Springs, Madison County, Cobb County, you've got a surprise coming. Near Horseshoe, the river begins to drop approximately 17 feet per mile as it goes toward Marshall. At Marshall, it expands again. But there, the flood and the river covered the railroad tracks by more than 7 feet in an hour on a sunny day, while along Main Street in Marshall, it swept away 53 buildings, and it moved the Southern Railway Depot 40 feet off its concrete foundations. Two members of the same family died there because they tried to swim out along Main Street in Marshall, where in an hour the river rose 5 feet, and they said, "Oh, we can make it across the street." They never did. One of the most, to me, frightening aspects, pictorially and looking at all the photographs of all the remnants of the Great Flood. By the way, this is not a promo, but I do have some pictures in my book, Remembering Asheville. And I do tell that story, not in this detail. Are the skeletons of railway bridges. They're just sitting there. And there are no pilings or anything underneath. And guys, as stupid men always will do, try to walk across. Have their pictures taken. This ain't nothing. And you see that everywhere. And they go down to the debris and to the river. They do. In Hot Springs, the entire town was nearly destroyed. The old Mountain Harper Hotel, which I've always considered one of the most magnificent in the mountains, went up to the second story. And there all the guests went up and hoped the flood would come just a few more feet. The old Waterloo golf course, probably the first in western North Carolina, washed away. Debris, dirt, and everything, all the way up to the foundations. Hot Springs, a town then of 1,500, now numbers 450. It's never, ever recovered. It was so devastating that in 1916, just after the Great Flood, the U.S. Army put a concentration camp there and housed over 3,000 Germans who got along very well with Mountaineers, it seems. Because the only way in and out was by railroad. And nobody tries to escape in Madison County. Nobody. Smaller communities, I do want to talk about them. Asheville, you can talk about Linville, I can talk about Belmont, Hot Springs, Marshall, but the smaller communities, a lot of them disappeared. Some of the most wonderful stories in history the mountains have. You consider around places like Spilcorn, got a lot of moonshine history there. Shelton Laurel, Cutshall, Punch and Fork, Faust, Sunburst, you name it. Some disappeared. You're talking about 1960. If you think the roads and the mountains are bad now, imagine 1960. One of my favorite stories about North Carolina and its history talks about the 1920s when the state introduced the Highway Patrol to show the authority of law enforcement in North Carolina, especially in the mountains. They sent up the entire Highway Patrol in 1926. 9 of them. Motorcycles and 4. The lieutenant had the 4. They got to Asheville and turned around and went back to Raleigh. Nobody in 1960 was going to venture very far outside Asheville. The roads, nothing. The bridges, nothing. And thus, those dirt roads, and thus those mountain roads, washed away, disappeared. If you looked around here in the counties, you'll see the bridges over those streams, gone. Some mountain communities were not reconnected for 2 weeks to a month. Now, all along the French Broad River, a sea of extras for barns, pastures, privies, although North Carolinians didn't like privies then. I mean, that was an innovation that came to western North Carolina with the New Deal. All nature was our urinal in 1960. And all that swept into the French Broad River. It was already pretty much a dead river. Wilma Dyckman Stokely makes that very clear. She brought the idea of environmentalism into the discussion as well. All along the river, we find the carcasses of horses, mules, oxen, chickens, and pigs lining its banks. I've calculated that approximately half the livestock in the French Broad River Basin is wiped out. It's 1960. Mountaineers already have a hard-scrabbled existence. Take away, in July, their crops, their pastures, their horses, their cows, their pigs. They're desperate. There isn't much left. From Old Fort to Asheville, landslides up to 28 feet buried much of the railroad track. A little east of here, a gauge at Mount Holly on the Catawba River measured it 45 feet. The gauge itself was drowned. And towns along the Catawba and the Linville River, raging torrents swept cotton bales, sheds, houses, cattle, warehouses, and piles of lumber along their currents and banks. A jigsaw puzzle of debris that took years and years to clear. When Katrina hit New Orleans, my son lived there. My daughter a few miles north in Picayune, Mississippi. I went to help see them and rescue them about a week after Katrina. I went back 6 months later, a year later. The stream of trucks, the piles of trailers, the debris along Interstate 55, 65, near all along I-10. You'd see this in western North Carolina in 1960. They did not have FEMA, did not have Jerry Behan and his emergency response teams. They didn't have so many. You couldn't declare this part a disaster area and send in help. How many Mountaineers had insurance, flood insurance back then, even any insurance? How many of them got any checks from the federal government? They didn't have anything. Lost in all of this, and I will tell you, another story has to do with how the Great Flood impacted the health of hundreds of thousands of Mountaineers. In Madison County, today there's no hospital. There's a clinic, Hot Springs, Mars Hill. And in 1916, Madison County had the finest hospital in the mountains called White Rock, up near Shelton Lawn, on the Long River. It had thousands of Mountaineers who somehow found their way to that little bitty place in the woods in August, September of 1960. Broken bones, intestinal, pulmonary diseases, all sorts of things. A couple of outbreaks here and there. It affected the health of Mountaineers as well as their economic well-being. And I've always been really gratified and amazed at how they helped each other. They really did. I would suspect that they reached out and knew their neighbors better then than now. Western North Carolina's geography ensures that flooding only too easily will occur today as it did a century ago. We had floods in 1902, 1908, 1928, 1940, 1977, and 2004. We're going to have one in the future. There'll be another symposium at some time in the future talking about the Great Flood of 2020 or whatever. It's going to occur. Now I want to bring into focus my final point. And that's how geography and politics in North Carolina assured another disaster. For reasons buried in history and in politics, North Carolina refused to cooperate with the TVA in the 1930s when they built the Tennessee Valley Authority, when they put in all that electricity in Tennessee. I lived in Martell, actually up in the mountains, very close to the Tennessee line. On the other side in Tennessee, and George W. Bush referred to this when he talked about North and South Korea. South Korea was lit up like a Christmas tree, and there were 3 lights on in North Korea. The 1930s, 40s, 50s, through the 60s, Tennessee was lit up like a Christmas tree, and the western North Carolina mountains were kept in the dark. The economic problems largely latent in the mountain today trace to that decision that North Carolina made not to participate in the TVA. My electric bill from the French Broad Electrical Co-op was twice my neighbors in Tennessee. And the co-op, guess where they get their power? They just resell it. North Carolina did not participate because it was a socialist program. And TVA and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were socialists. When FDR ran again, 1936, Alf Landon, the landslide, Landon might have gotten, 15 electoral votes, maybe 400 some odd for FDR. Madison County, which had no radio, very few, no idea who Alf Landon was. Didn't know anything about him. Kansas, where's that? Voted for Alf Landon, 4-1 over FDR. At exactly the same time, they took the railroad into Asheville to collect the relief checks. But that's just the sort of political landscape of the mountain counties. Today, North Carolina and the TVA and cooperation between federal and state, it just isn't going to happen. Jim was telling this story. He tried to organize a panel and discussion on the TVA today. And how many people came, Jim?
This was back in the 70s.
Back in the 70s.
A lot of effort to organize. 0 people came.
Nobody came. Nobody came. And so what did you and your sponsors do?
Oh, we got drunk.
They went out and got drunk. Because it is fruitless. And thus, when I came from Highlands today, they're still repairing that dang old earthen dam. And Canoga is still up there. The Swannanoa is still going to flood. And we're still going to have another great flood. As Hugh Stephens said, it's just a matter of when. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Anthony Sadler. Was born in Tampa, Florida. He received his BA in history from the University of Georgia. So we've got two Georgia here. And Anthony, I believe you met your wife in Georgia.
I did.
Mallory, where's Mallory? There she is. She doesn't want to stand up. Currently, Anthony is a second-year graduate student at Appalachian State University, and today he's going to share with us parts of his master's thesis You can read a little bit about it in the program, but I thought it would be a good compliment to Dr. Reddy's description of the flood, because Anthony is focusing on the flood's impact on Asheville as an industrializing city in 1916 and the social as well as economic impacts that disaster had on Asheville with long-lasting effects. So give a hand to Anthony Savin.
Thank you very much, Jim, for having me, Hugh, for organizing this event, and Dr. Reddy for starting us off in such an excellent way. I want to give a little bit of a preview of my thesis to start off with, but while I was sitting there listening to what Dr. Reddy was talking about, it was interesting, especially at this event, how we're talking about 100 years ago, tomorrow, and kind of what we're looking at in the future, what we have to deal with in this region, what Ashevilleans have to deal with on a regular basis with flooding. Part of my research took me to the mayor's office, where I was looking through very old, and for an historian, exciting minute books about this event and in the months leading up to the event. And it was interesting because I was there and I was within earshot of the secretary to the mayor, and he was sitting at his desk very diligently taking phone calls about all sorts of things, from Sasquatches to, I mean, it was an interesting overhearing conversations. But probably the most common call that he got was about streets flooding during rain. And as I'm listening to him discuss, hey, we're doing the best we can. I know that street's really bad for it. That cul-de-sac is horrible about flooding. I'm reading my minute books from 100 years prior about the exact same issue and the exact same complaint from citizens of Asheville to the mayor then, who was Mayor Rankin. And it's interesting to me, throughout my entire research on 1916, I tried to tie this flood into a larger narrative, both nationally, globally, statewide, how much I saw that I recognized from today. And I think it's the curse of being an historian, that you see that on a regular basis, but it's also, in some ways, a pleasure when you're dealing with more kind of upbeat topics. My story begins actually on July 17th, or technically the evening of July 16th. So I'm talking more about, flood comes, as Dr. Reddy described so excellently, and then it leaves, the water goes. And so what happens at that point? How do people respond? How do people pull themselves back together? How do we rebuild bridges? How do we, build better buildings? And that's what I really wanted to try to tackle in my thesis. Now, I looked at everything that was available, and I realized that Asheville is two things historically. Asheville is the land of the sky. It is an ideal. It is a narrative that was developed by the area's tourist boosters, and not just this area, tourist boosters from all over the country that describe this land as being, full of strange people and a peculiar place for its health benefits. It's also what lies under that veneer. And I like the term veneer. Darren Waters, who wrote an excellent PhD dissertation on the African American community in his town, called it Beneath the Veneer. That veneer is that ideal. And Asheville, at the time of this flood, was incredibly more complex than we've been able to recognize so far. The hardest part of any historian's job dealing with a city like Asheville is trying to get the voices of everybody involved. And I've tried to do that the best that I can. But the task is to reconcile those two, this veneer and what lied beneath it, the reality that was involved. So I want to preview my thesis just a little bit, just kind of cover what I'm talking about. But then I'm going to go into more details into actually my second chapter, which deals with July 17th and the few weeks afterwards. And I'm going to touch a little bit on the long-term effects as well. My first chapter is actually titled Collusion of Man and Nature. It deals with the flood itself, the actual hurricanes that came down on top of the region. The driving question I have is, what makes a flood great? call it the Great Flood of 1916, and there's a lot of reasons to call it that, trust me. There were 5 states affected. It wasn't just an Asheville problem, it was a regional problem. Southeastern Appalachians were heavily hit. The Catawba River flooded, every southeastern river flooded, okay? So what makes a flood great? What I came up with was that, yes, you had a unique cyclical meteorological phenomenon, these 2 hurricanes. It was an El Nino year, like this year. It was in the La Nina stage, which actually creates more hurricanes on the eastern side of the United States. The 1916 hurricane year was still one of the most active ever. Ever. So you had El Nino. You also had a very unique way that men were handling the environment in those days. An incredible amount of deforestation, which makes those soils that Dr. Reddy talked about even harder to absorb. It basically pushed all the topsoil off. Farmers, as he mentioned as well, were dealing with that effect for years and years afterwards. Not only did they lose the crops for that year, but they lost the topsoil for the next 5 years. Okay? So the deforestation, the earthen dams that he mentioned, there were a lot more earthen dams than I could ever trace in this region. And because it wasn't TVA, because it was basically private people that were building these things for these corporate resorts in Hendersonville and elsewhere, there's no way to know exactly what they were, how they were built, why they were built, whether they were built to even sustain normal flooding, let alone the unique events of 1916. So these dams played a huge part in what was going on. And also at the time in the region, especially in Asheville, you have a population growth that is really bringing the city to a brink of not being able to handle itself. It always struggled with providing water, it struggled with providing sanitation, and this is at a time when they were drunk on progressivism. The idea of taking care of everybody meaning mostly white, middle class, merchant folks in the town. But that meant clean streets and paved roads, and living in a city that was protected from these outside influences. So I talk a little bit about that. My second chapter is called Appalachian Baptism, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. This flood, in a weird way, was a baptism. It cleaned the slate in a strange situation where the progressive leaders of the town looked at it and said, okay, this happened. Now what can we do with it? How can we build it, make it better, move on? And in some ways they did do that, but in other ways they turned their back on large portions of the economic situation. I agree with Dr. Reddy that the Riverside District was the heartbeat of the economy at the time. One of the long-term effects that they had is they reprioritized that to the point that essentially they went all in on tourism, and they realized maybe that's not the best bet for us. Maybe with these floods happening on a regular basis, those companies can't survive. And so we need to shift our focus to this tourism idea that is more sustainable in a weird way. We all know now that form of tourism with the kind of real estate boom that came after it was not sustainable, but they didn't know that then. So the big question I want to ask about the Appalachian Baptism is how the local leaders respond, why, and what were the immediate consequences. And like I said, I'll get into that a little bit later. The theme is uneven recovery and those consequences. And then my third chapter is actually the consequences of idealism. So with creating this ideal land of the sky, how did the flood shape Asheville in the long term within that perspective? Floods occur in real time and space, but the way we have to rationalize them as human beings, we have to put them into some kind of framework. How do we move on for something so devastating? How do we incorporate that into our memory? How do we tell our children about it? When things happen on TV, if you do have kids, you have to think, how do I tell my son about Ferguson? How do I tell, my daughter about Katrina when she learns about it in school? How do we talk about 9/11? It becomes a narrative, it becomes a part of who we are, it becomes a part of this region. And that idealism is really what kind of drove the way that the city responded to this. And I look at 3 ideals: an ideal society, which is collective over individual; the ideal economy, which is tourism. They saw it as sustainable. They tried to capitalize on the great demand at the turn of the century driven by democratic travelers. You have the car coming on. You have roads, not so much rails. It's cheaper to get to Asheville at the time. So definitely driven by this demand for Asheville in a certain way. And you have the ideal citizen, which is closer related to society, but it has to do with that fever that Thomas Wolfe talked about. Thomas Wolfe was a dissenter of this idea, and I talk about him a good bit in my third chapter. He did not fit the ideal. And you know, he has a quote here where he says, "In my hometown, I was regarded as a black sheep, a pariah, an outcast who had cruelly and savagely attacked his own people and had written a slanderous history of the community over the last 50 years. And of course, that's from his book, The Homeward Angel. He talked about the flood. He was 16 when it happened. He wasn't here, but it affected his mentality, it affected the way that he thought about the place. Thomas Wolfe, as a local historian, deals with floods enough in his books to really give a little more credit to him for looking at the river, looking at the way people responded to it, and thinking maybe we should have done this a little bit differently. So today's theme is Asheville's institutions. I want to talk a good bit about how they responded to the flood of 1916 with an uneven and sometimes violent hand. It's not a pretty story, but I don't think the floods are pretty, and I don't think there's a way that you can walk away from them with any kind of true good feelings. Yes, there was heroism. Yes, there were people that came to the aid of others. That happens. The community pulled together the best they could. But the community was also bound by the way that it was set up before the flood happened. It was bound by progressive tendencies in the South at the time. It was bound by Jim Crow segregation. It was bound by anti-Semitism. It was bound by a lot of things that defined that period and defined Asheville, but also very much dictated how they responded to this event. So the three key points that I want to talk about that laid the foundation for this uneven recovery was, one, false promises of control. In a progressive city, you have the idea that we can control these things. We can control these external factors, crime, natural disasters, all the bad things that just come along with especially living in the Appalachian Mountains. It's almost as if they dreamed so big of becoming New York City or another major metropolis in the country that they forgot that they live here. And they have to deal with things here that are very localized. The second thing is uneven relief. So yes, there were relief. Yes, there were committees that were formed. There was federal aid. There was an act of Congress that actually committed $500,000 to all the states affected. Asheville said no to that money, although the state of North Carolina as a whole did. There were state-bound committees that were organized by Governor Locke Craig. Asheville said no to that money as well. So, you know, there's reasons why there was uneven relief, and it was simply a decision-making process on the part of the locals. And then the third thing is occupational segregation. I don't want to talk about necessarily today anyway, more racial stuff, but occupational. And that puts me in the Riverside District Square and how that area developed and why that area, even though it handled the bulk of the disaster itself in the Asheville proper anyway, why they did not get the kind of relief that they really deserved. So, false promises of control, I touched on a little bit. The 3 points I want to point out with that is that the policies that were designed by the government at the time were designed to protect and provide for the growing middle class. That was the dominant priority for Asheville's leaders in today. And this was driven by a certain entitlement that permeated most progressives in the country. Like I said, I really do desire to tie this into a national agenda, although there's a southern story here. But the idea that these middle-class folks that were rising at the time felt like they were entitled based upon the retribution of their fathers. They wanted to move past this idea of having to live in hardship, having to live in squalor, having to grow their food. They wanted to move past that. They felt like it was the time to have that kind of freedom, to not have to work so hard for their living. And they felt like their predecessors, the first generation of industrialists, left them a world that was polluted, left them a world that was reeking of greed, that was driven by aristocratic old money, you know. They felt like they were being kept from the true full nature of the freedoms they should have had bound by the Constitution of this country. Second, cities developed in the nation based upon the false pretense of the control, as I talked about, those external threats. And third, the flood challenged the hegemony of the progressives and put stress on the hierarchy set up to support the new system. There's a lot of larger issues going on here. As Asheville was transitioning to a metropolis, as they were trying to make it work for that kind of an urban system, hierarchy is necessary. You need a stronger specialization of jobs. You need people that can carry the garbage from the streets that are in the merchant area or the downtown area and the tourist area. You need people that run the sewage system that carries everything to the French Broad. You need people to work the tanneries. You need people to work the cotton. You need hierarchy. You also need people who run banks. You need people who run the government. You need people who run the drugstores that deliver drugs to your door, the grocers who deliver groceries to your door. This is social hierarchy. And they needed that in Asheville, and they started to really set themselves up to be able to have that. The second key factor I want to talk about is the Associated Charities and uneven relief. So the Associated Charities were actually organized on the evening of July 16th. They met. It was, like most things in those days that were philanthropic, it was driven by the leaders of the city, business, church, and government. But it was a separate entity. Now, at the time, the city had an Associated Charities. It had been around since the late 19th century. It was pulled together to fight against vagrancy, to fight against public health issues, but it wasn't strong enough to handle this crisis. They did not have the funds to handle the crisis. They didn't have the people. Ms. Pearl Weaver was the head of the Associated Charities. She had 3 different people that worked for her, and mostly she dealt with homeless people and people in prisons. So certainly the Associated Charities that was in place was not set up to be able to handle the floods. So they organized this Citizens Relief Committee. It was set up by Thomas Harkins, who was an attorney and the son of the former mayor. There were a lot of other very prominent people that were involved in it, including the founders of the Van Winkle law firm. But it was established to provide aid, although it couldn't handle it. Later, the African American community set up their own Associated Charities. At the time, with the segregated Jim Crow South, they were seeing that they could handle it themselves. But the problem is that even though they established their own, they had far lesser resources to work with. The African American community at the time was very, very, very small part of this population. So they had limited numbers of professional contributors. The main thing I want to point out about the charities, and especially the Citizens Relief Committees, that it blurred the lines between public and private. It was partially funded by the city government. The city government donated money every month to them. They had oversight by the city government. They couldn't do certain acts without the government approving it, even though it was a separate entity. And it was supported and funded by the business and local government leaders. So these charities that associated with that kind of rose up because of this flood did provide heroic efforts for food, furniture, housing, and other materials for the flood-stricken families. It was very family-focused. There's stories of them delivering entire wagons full of flour to the cotton mill district so that the folks who were suffering there could have that. But it is important to point out that it only existed for 5 weeks. That when it first came up, it was only for white people specifically, and that only after 3 weeks did they start giving some money to the African American families in town. On the 5th week, they donated the rest of that money to the Associated Charities, the main group, which once again cut off any kind of funds for anybody other than the white families in town. There was no such aid for businesses, although there were attempts to pull together. And in my 3rd chapter, I deal with that more directly on how those attempts failed and why they failed. But essentially, businesses were left to deal with this disaster on their own, which is fine and dandy if you're the National Gasket Company or if you're the Southern Railway, right? But if you're Sternberg, metal shop, kind of recyclables, it's harder for you to recover from this thing on your own. If you're a small business, small manufacturer, if you're local, it's really difficult for you to be able to pull the funds together, especially when banks in town at the time mostly served the elites of the town. There was no, outside of Finkelstein Savings and Loan, there wasn't a whole lot going on for small working class families that might have owned a business to try to recover from this disaster. So I deal with that directly in my 3rd chapter, but that in itself had very much long-term effects, because what you ended up having after the flood is a few businesses were fine. They were fine. You also ended up with a couple of businesses that joined a more corporate model. So the lumber mills joined corporate models with folks from Michigan. So they became bigger in order to try to recover from this. They lobbied for money themselves from Governor Craig, to some success, but not entirely. So they started to look outside of Asheville because they realized, hey, they don't care about us. The editor-in-chief of the Asheville Citizen talked a good bit about whether or not we want these businesses to be here. Do we want them to last? And if we do, we need to help them. And no help came. So although I have no idea what businesses failed, what businesses stuck around, that's certainly part of my research that I'll get to. I do know that it was not an environment that was conducive to be able to last through this thing unless you have already had a lot of capital waiting for you or basically an open bank account. The occupational segregation part is important for the last part of my story because it deals with the Riverside District directly. And I want to talk first about the fact that the Riverside District was set up the way it was, partly because it was geographic, partly because of the kind of jobs that they did. Obviously, the river itself supports certain kinds of businesses, you know? If you're going to own a tannery, you need a river. If you're going to operate an ice-making company, you need a lot of water, so you need a river. So there's definitely a geographic part to why those businesses were there. Most factories in Asheville at the time were relatively new since the Civil War. These are late 19th century factories. The industrial part of town was pretty new. But like I said, it was the heartbeat, as Dr. Reddy put it so well, of the economy. He's right. If you needed anything in town outside of pharmaceuticals, a nice dress, a hat, sundries of all sorts, you had to go to the Riverside District to get it. If you wanted coal, you had to go there, or they had to come to you and deliver it. If you wanted ice, you had to go there. If you wanted, the railway station was also sort of a market in itself. If you wanted to sell certain goods, you had to go to the Riverside District. But yeah, most factories were brand new. They did represent an old school of doing things. They represent an old kind of industrialization, not the newer types that came in the 30s and 40s, but these were new to Asheville for the most part. It was a mixture of large national and local enterprises and small local sites, so as far as the hierarchy is concerned, it was very much mixed. It was mixed race. It was very much based upon a fraternal corporate model where, say, the cotton mill had its homes that they built and rented out to their employees. They built schools for their employees. They built churches for their employees. Everything was meant to be right there. So they didn't have to venture out too far and they could work many, many, many hours and not have to worry about whether or not they're going to be there or not. The early 20th century changes. There was a sewer system that was put into town around that time, and it ran out into the French Broad about that place. It's important to mention that because when the flood came through, it actually broke those pipes. So sewage was actually leaking from the ground after the flood. The Power and Light Company was operating around that time as well at the flood. And you had landfills starting up. You had an incinerator downtown, but you also had a landfill along the Riverside District, which, interesting enough, is where the brewery is being built. It's an old landfill site. The rise of the merchant class in the district of downtown is also important because the merchant class was starting to demand certain amenities that came along with this progressive attitude. And that also essentially set up this segregation I'm talking about. And I don't mean segregation in the sense of like outright abuse. I mean in the sense of starting to view yourself as different and be treated as different. There are those that create the trash, they put it in the cans, and then those that come and pick it up and take it elsewhere. And you were seen as dirty or criminal or vagrant if you were one, and you were seen as upright and proper if you were the other. And in Asheville at the time, a big part of the transition to this metropolis, the idea of what they were trying to propose was having that difference. The Asheville business hierarchy can be broadly explained as elites. You have them at the top, folks like E.W. Grove, Fred Seeley, people we hear a lot about in this town. You have the commercial middle class, and you have the Riverside labor class. The River District itself was also the flood district. Anytime they talk about the flooded area, the flood district, in newspapers, that's what they're talking about in Asheville. Asheville, we know, is on a hill. It wasn't dealt directly with this flood. They lost their power, which meant a lot as far as their security is concerned. The lights were relatively new, and they felt like it was going to save them from crime. So they were certainly scared. They were cut off from the world in a very real sense. They did not have the kinds of food that they were used to. They did not have the kinds of communication lines they were used to. They were cut off, but they were not underwater. What was left in the Riverside District as well is this toxic sediment, the excrement, carcasses of animals, the cages with dead chickens still in them. That's what was left in the Riverside District. That's what people were shoveling out of their homes and out of their businesses and trying to clean up because they were very aware of the public health concerns, but they were also left to themselves to deal with it. So these three factors contributed to social tension in those days. And the flood played a major part in at least one instance of violence on the darkened streets of the flood district. And I'm going to start talking about this issue of the Bradley and Ledford trial, which was a case of police brutality that occurred within the darkened Cotton Mill district on July 19th. So it was just a few days after the flood. I do want to point out that there are three catalysts to this situation. One is the reputation of the Cotton Mill district. It was seen as a place for nefarious items. It was seen as a place where people did things you don't want to know what's going on. It was seen in general, the Riverside District was seen in general as a place you only go to for a very specific purpose, whether it is immoral or it is to get coal. But the difference is daytime and nighttime as far as why you're there. Now, this reputation certainly wasn't wholly deserved, okay? It had a lot more to do with what was unknown about that area by folks who lived in the merchant district in downtown. The second thing is martial law. There's a lot of debate at the time about whether or not martial law existed in Asheville at the time after the flood. And I would say that at least some elements of martial law existed, and I'll go over those in just a second. And the third is this racial and class tension that was set up before the flood. So, the martial law situation, these are my arguments for why I believe there was. First, there was a higher police presence than ever before in Asheville at the time. 50 streetcar men were deputized the day of the flood. So the streetcars, obviously without electricity, were shut down. In order to provide jobs for those streetcar men, in order to prevent them from leaving town, in order to prevent them from being vagrants or busking on the streets of Asheville, they deputized them. They gave them billy clubs, they told them to stand on the corners of the flood district, and they told them to discourage crime and round up the homeless people that they found, which at the time were a lot, especially in the Cotton Mill district. 60 homes were destroyed in the Cotton Mill district because of this flood. There are a lot of homeless people. But the difference is that a lot of the white families, because of the efforts of the Citizens Relief Committee, were placed in homes of others throughout the city. It's one of the things that they did. If you were homeless, you applied to them and they said, yes, you're homeless because of this flood, they put you in a home of somebody else who was safe. So if you're still homeless as of July 19th, the chances are you didn't fit the description of the people that they were trying to help. There was a strong fear of fire in the Riverside District. The sediment that was left had a lot of gasoline in it, and they were worried that even if you lit a match, that you would set the area on fire. And they posted signs throughout the district stating, quote, "Deputies on guard, ready to shoot," end quote, even if you lit a match. And finally, citizens in the flood district in general were very, very agitated. You can imagine the kind of situation that's going on, and I know this from the letters that were coming in to the Asheville citizens editors, and how they were describing even folks that were fine from the flood, even folks that weren't underwater, felt very agitated, very frustrated. They didn't know what was going on. They felt like the government wasn't being as active as they should be, especially for a progressive town. They confiscated private property for public use. Mainly this was gasoline, but they went into private homes that had gasoline saved, and they confiscated it for public use. And they established curfews for the flooded district. If it was nightfall, you were not supposed to be out and about. And if you were, you're presumed to be doing something wrong. So, on the night of July 19th at 10 o'clock, in the Cotton Mill district on the Riverside side, a young man by the name of Burgeon Davis, he was 20 years old, was walking with a companion. He heard a commotion And when he heard that commotion, he looked around. And what he saw was officers J.C. Ledford and J.N. Bradley beating a black man who was handcuffed. Why was he handcuffed? Was it vagrancy? Was it that he was lighting a match? Nobody knows, because the rest of the trial that proceeded never mentioned exactly what he was doing and why they were arresting him. Davis's companion, decided to intervene, and he yelled at the officers, "Hey, what are you doing?" The policemen turned around and started charging after them. They told them that if they knew what was good for them, they would head on down the line. You would move on. This is none of your business. So the guys did. Davis and his friend continued to walk down the flood district. Later, the officers caught up to Davis. Officer Bradley grabbed Davis by the mouth and punched him in the nose. Then, when he was on the ground, he beat him in the back of the head repeatedly. When it was all done, the guys brushed themselves off and decided that they were going to press charges against the officers for actions unbecoming. Now, at the time, and still now, if you're going to charge an officer for anything, you have to go to the mayor's office. And you have to talk to the commissioners. And they're the ones that actually try the officers. The trial began on July 25th. It was presided over by Mayor Rankin. And throughout the entire trial, that lasted actually several months, mostly because of delays, because the prosecutors and the other attorneys, for some reason, had a tendency not to show up for court. There were 40 witnesses brought. Now, on the side of the officers, you had the best names in this town. You had D.H. Ramsey, you had Miss Pearl Weaver, you had folks that established the foundation for this city, testifying on behalf of these officers. And on the other side of it, you had a 13-year-old cotton mill girl. You had a man that was estimated to be about 75 years old, who was a cotton mill worker. And you had a couple of colored folks who spoke to the fact that they had experienced the same kind of abuse on behalf of Bradley and Ledford. This case showcased the underlying racial and class tension that existed in the town after the flood. It centered on this merchant versus the riverside attitudes. It wasn't necessarily racial, it was class-based, predominantly. The trial focused on, quote, the incorrigibility of the neighborhood where the policemen were on duty. It was seen that the policemen did what they had to do for both the times and the place that they were in. But really what it turned out to be was rich whites versus poor whites with a black man in the middle. Bradley and Ledford's character were brought out. The folks that lived in the Cotton Mill District spoke to the fact that they had a reputation for this sort of thing. Both officers were actually fined for the kinds of things that were brought out during the trials. For instance, cursing at a 16-year-old girl while acting as an officer. They threatened to kill a black man while they were arresting him. Things like that came out in this trial. But the district in general had a reputation for being this place that you go to that's dangerous and you shouldn't be kind of hanging around at night anyway. So the results of the trial was Prosecutor George Bennell actually requested the officers be removed from force. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted them to be taken off the force. The commissioners generally believed that the charges were trumped up. The witnesses of both sides painted very different pictures of the characters, so there wasn't any really common thread there. So they had to try to decide on what side they believed were telling the truth, really. And it really was a trial about class animosity. In the end, Mayor Rankin's decision was to put the officers on 15 days of paid suspension, and actually spoke about their, quote, reputation as efficient, energetic officers, and spoke mostly about how the area was the kind of area that deserved that sort of a heavy hand. If anything was trumped up at the time, though, it was fear. And I really want to get into, in my thesis, this idea of fear and how it was used to be able to do what they were trying to do. The end result, though, was that the police chief claimed that there were no crimes of any importance that were committed in the city since the flood. So despite this abuse and other abuses, no crimes reported. They also claimed that the gasoline they were about setting on fire, and this is the chief of police, was swallowed up by the river, which surely evaporate before fires could really be committed. So the signs were put up, but I don't know why. And D.H. Ramsey claimed that there was no martial law, so there's no reason to be worried about it, even though there were a lot of citizens that were concerned about what was going on at the time. The fear itself is justified because this is 1 year after the Leo Frank case, which was a big case that broke in Asheville. They spoke about it a good bit, and they were concerned about what went on. And in general, they felt like the response to the mobs, the response to the violence with a heavy hand of government and police was the proper response. But Asheville was a very different place. In a much smaller minority community, there was no threat of violence ever in Asheville at the time. They couldn't even organize in the right way. So it's interesting to think about, they were afraid of this mob violence, they were afraid of these issues coming up at the flood, but at the same time, their reaction to that fear was so much heavier and violent than what actually occurred on the part of the people. So in review, I talked about my chapters, I talked about today's theme, which was Asheville's institutions responding with a heavy and violent hand. And I do want to point out that despite the heroic efforts on the part of the rich and poor legislators, law enforcement, citizens that came out and helped out, there were these instances that didn't quite fit this idea of uplift and equality. And that's why I say that it was an uneven recovery. So my conclusion for today, and what I want to leave you with, is that uneven relief led to uneven recovery, which shaped the social, economic, environmental, and cultural institutions of present-day Asheville. Thank you.